All right, so tonight we are in for a treat. John Zino is going to talk to us about critical theory. If you have no idea what critical theory is, then A, join the crowd, but B, you'll realize how important this is and how much this has impacted your life without you even knowing it, the things that is happening on this campus. And so as we sort of walk through what a Christian worldview is, we did that last week, and now we're going to begin the rest of the semester looking at different ways in which our Christian worldview is going to be challenged, certainly on the campus, but in other places as well. And so I know a lot of people are excited to hear Dr. Zino talk about this, so that's your key.
There you go. You want to show the video first? Yeah, let's just do the video first.
All right. Never mind. We're going to show a video.
Yeah, but you got to put the.
So we're going to turn the lights down low because we're going to make it spooky.
Very spooky.
But without the consequences.
Right. Okay. This is getting.
Welcome. Ignore that. It will end. Now, our first question. 1 plus 1. Yes.
2.
Incorrect. Yes.
Multiculturalism.
Well done. Next question. What is 3 times 3? Yes?
9.
Wrong. Yes, Penelope.
Gender equality.
Very good, Penelope.
Is this a joke?
Do you think gender equality is a joke?
No, but isn't this a maths class?
Don't be so racist.
I just asked a question.
We don't ask questions. Questions are offensive.
Yeah!
Now, students, I trust you all completed your research assignment. And remember, the person with the highest mark will be flying to New York to present their paper at the World Mathematics Summit. Well done, Penelope. 6 out of 10. You too, Simon. 6 out of 10.
Hey, be careful. You've been staring at her for 10 seconds.
What?
It's a form of harassment to stare at a woman for more than 15 seconds straight. And when I use the term straight, I don't mean to offend any persons of a non-traditional sexual preference. And when I use the term non-traditional, I don't mean to offend any persons who oppose historically normalized...
Okay, I get it.
Unfortunately, Sunshine, your research assignment is only worth a 1 out of 10.
I've used Fourier transform and mathematical methods in electronics to analyze the electrodiagrams of at-risk patients and calculate their risk of experiencing a heart attack. I mean, it's a new method, but it could potentially save thousands of lives.
7.
You barely even read it.
You used red pen.
What?
Red is considered offensive in many religions.
Why would you belittle everything down to a singular colour? Well, humanity is a rainbow of beauty and spirituality.
Yeah. Okay, fine. 7 out of 10, but that still means I get to go to the summit, right?
The marking process isn't over yet. Now, because we're in a society based on equality, the total amount of marks are to be divided equally among our students.
You've got to be kidding me.
Well done, students. We're all equal. We're all average.
Yay!
But then who gets to go to the summit?
Oh, we haven't added our privilege points yet. Don't you know anything?
That is correct. Now, Penelope, you are female, so that's +1
1 privilege point. However, you are white, so that's -1. I'm also bisexual. +1. That leaves you with a total score of 6 out of 10.
Simon, unfortunately, you're straight, white, and male.
And cisgender.
Yes, so that's -4 privilege points, which leaves you with a total score of 1.
Certainly fair.
Thank you. You're male, and I don't like you. So that's -2 privilege points, but you are brown and sexually ambiguous. So that's that leaves you with a total score of 5.
Wait, why am I sexually ambiguous?
And finally, sunshine.
I'm gay, I'm trans, I'm Asian, I'm overweight, I'm lower class, I'm unintelligent, unattractive, I've got hairs on my nipples, and I also got body odor, and I can't really run properly or tie my shoelaces by myself. I once watched a pigeon die.
Wonderful sunshine. That's 13 privilege points. That leaves you with a total score of 18 out of 10. Well done, sunshine. You're going to New York. Hooray,
We
sunshine!
knew you could do it!
Let me see this. They've just written equality and drawn love hearts on a piece of paper.
He expressed himself, and it's beautiful.
He didn't even spell equality correctly.
We don't discriminate.
This has nothing to do with mathematics.
You think you're so great with your maths and your science and your facts? What about feelings, huh?
Yeah. Feelings are more important than facts.
Yeah! This is wrong. You're all crazy.
Stop violating me with your different opinions.
I have the right to speak my mind.
No, we have the right not to be offended.
And that's more important. And if you don't stop verbally assaulting us, we will be forced to attack you in self-defense.
Can't do that.
Actually, we have every right to do so.
And it's illegal for you to fight back.
Yeah!
This is insane.
Prepare to die a noble social justice warrior. Death!
Welcome. Ignore that. It will end.
Thanks. Thank you. Is that the other light? Okay, all right. Well, it's a little bit of an intense beginning to our talk, but I wanted to talk tonight a little bit about, can you hear me? Is this recording? So everybody can hear me okay? Yeah, okay, good. I don't usually have a problem being heard. So we're gonna talk tonight about a subject that you probably know quite well. You just may not realize you know it very well, and it's the subject, the topic of critical theory. This is we're going to look tonight at critical theory. We're looking this whole semester at worldviews. Last week, Aaron talked about the Christian worldview, what things compose the Christian worldview, what elements we can point to that would be representative of the Christian worldview. We're going to look tonight at another worldview which is very prevalent today on college and university campuses. And that's the worldview of critical theory. And we've kind of thrown a couple of these things up here so you can see it. I think you're probably familiar with the ideas of critical theory, but not the actual elements that are behind it. So part of what I want to do tonight is try to keep the dialogue open and sort of discussion oriented, but I really want to spend some time just talking to you about what I've learned and what I've discovered in the past 6 months as I've been preparing to teach. I teach a class here at UNCW. I teach first year seminar. Got a couple of my students out there. There's Ariel. And in preparing to teach the class, I began to notice a lot of elements of critical theory that were blended into the educational model that is used today in universities. I didn't necessarily recognize it at first, but as I began to study it more and more, I began to realize what was happening and some of the things I was seeing. So I actually began to do research on it. And in fact, we're going to talk a lot about this book that I got out of the library. And we're going to talk about race, class, and gender, the ideas behind critical theory, where they came from, what the constituent elements of the worldview are, and how as Christians we can respond to critical theory in a thoughtful way, but standing on facts and truth and evidence, and not necessarily giving in to just pure feelings and emotions, which was really the reason we showed the video, somewhat of a parody video. But I wanted you to see it just to kind of get started. So before I really jump into this too much, I want to give some recognition to a guy named Neil Shenvi. He is he's actually kind of a guy, sort of, a man after my own heart. He's got a PhD in theoretical chemistry, but he's taught at Berkeley and at Yale and Duke, went to Berkeley. And he has actually spent a lot of time studying critical theory and Christianity. So understanding how these two worldviews line up. He is, I would say, a very reformed Christian. His views of Christianity are a very reformed, theological reformed view. And he has really put together a lot of very good material on this comparison between these two worldviews. It's called Free Thinking Ministries. Gotten a lot of information from it. So if you're interested, you can Google it or look it up. He's got a really good Facebook page, a lot of good materials. The other source of information that I used was actually from your university. Anybody recognize this? This is the book used for first-year seminar students. And you don't have to go past page 2 to encounter critical theory. In fact, it says it right here. It is all throughout the educational model system. Now, this is the book the students use. I'm going to share with you information that the university gave me as an instructor to use to teach you, the students. So you're going to get a little bit of an insight into some of the things that the faculty are given to help teach you better when it comes to ideas around critical theory, so you can recognize this. So a little bit of an inside look tonight at some of the things that your professors are actually given when it comes to teaching. And there's the video. Okay, we went past that. So we're going to talk about critical theory. We're going to talk about some of the things you saw in the video. And we're going to talk about what this looks like in popular culture. And you're probably familiar with some of this, so I won't go into too much of it. But when you hear people making statements such as, well, men really can't have a moral position on abortion, because after all, that's a woman's issue, that's a sign of critical theory. And we'll get into why that is. When you talk about challenging or questioning somebody's lived personal experiences, like the young lady in the video, and you get a very strong response back, that is an example of critical theory. And we're going to look at what those elements are, and then how we as Christians can respond to some of the things you're going to see and hear, and you probably have already seen and heard on campus. So we're going to look at critical theory, what its main views are, what its main tenets are, and then see how it compares to the Christian worldview. Of course, I'm assuming most of you have a pretty good handle on what a Christian worldview is. One thing that I want to caution you is, and we've got a little quiz at the end of the presentation. No test, just a little quiz. But I'm going to give you a little quiz for you to think about and see whether or not critical theory has actually influenced your Christian worldview. And I'd be willing to bet in a group this size with this many people, you may think you possess a biblical Christian worldview, and you probably do have many elements of that, but I'd be willing to bet there's a handful of you, without even realizing it, that have allowed the worldview of critical theory to infiltrate your Christian worldview, because there are some areas of overlap between them, and it's easy to assimilate into your worldview without even realizing it. And so we're going to do a little quiz at the end, and you can kind of test yourself to see, and we'll go through and kind of give you an opportunity to self-reflect on your own view, why you answered the questions the way you did, and why you think about it. And then as Christians, how we should respond to critical theory in a biblical, godly way. So, okay, so that's the plan for tonight. Any questions on the plan? This is our plan of attack for tonight. Okay. So this book that I showed you a moment ago is actually the 7th edition of that book, written in 1992 by two writers, Anderson and Collins. This was really the first comprehensive anthology collection of works on critical theory. It was in the early 1990s, and when it was written, it was very fringe. Almost nobody knew what critical theory was. Nobody was using it in educational systems, and it was really just the start of what we know today as many of the educational programs that we see in universities today. Many years ago, when I was an undergrad, these types of gender, race, ethnicity, and lifestyle study degree programs didn't even exist. But within the last generation or so, essentially since all of you have been students, pretty much from kindergarten to today, this has become the predominant worldview from which education is taught. It is very highly penetrated in schools, in many of the social sciences, psychology, philosophy, the humanities, education. If you're majoring in education, if you're going to school to learn how to become a teacher, everything you will be taught through the lens almost exclusively of critical theory. So it's incredibly important that you see and understand this. The roots of the idea actually trace back a number of years into the early 1930s in Germany. It has evolved considerably since then. I won't go into all the history. But one thing we're going to see as we go through this, and this is why it's so challenging to pick out this worldview, is what you're going to find is it is a blend of about 6 or 7 different worldviews all merged together. It actually has elements of Christianity in it, which can make it a little deceiving or a little difficult to pick out. And so we're going to look at the elements of this worldview and what it's composed of, and then how we as Christians can respond. Okay, so there's about, the next 3 or 4 slides are a little dry. I've got to get through them because it's important to go through the elements of critical theory. So there's about 6 major elements of critical theory. The entire theory really rests upon understanding the power dynamics between relational power dynamics between different social groups. And these power dynamics are usually divided into binary groups. So for example, male, female, white, non-white, heterosexual, homosexual. These are the power dynamics that are involved in critical theory. And a key assumption, a key takeaway is that the theory focuses on the identity of individuals being inseparable with the identity of the group with which you are associated. And the identities generally fall into one of 2 broad categories. There is the oppressed group and the oppressor group. Now this is where it gets a little complicated, so you got to stay with me. The definition of oppressed and oppressor changes depending on the dynamic of the 2 groups in question, and we'll get to that in a minute. That's why it's a little complicated, because one group of people could be an oppressor or viewed as an oppressor in one circumstance, but that same group could be viewed as being oppressed in another one. So it's hard to pin down. So this is why I want to go through this kind of step by step. The key assumptions, and I'm going to go through each of these with the key assumption. The key assumptions is that traditional education models, pretty much up until the last 20 years, have not helped people see themselves as oppressors. So if you find yourself in this worldview in the oppressor group, and we'll get to what that is, by definition, you've not really been trained to see yourself that way. And so the oppressors, whichever group that is, tend to be blind to their own oppressive behavior. And the people who are oppressed by that person or that group respond to it appropriately. And so when you look at, make sure I do this right. So when you look at these, the oppressor group generally oppresses or subjugates the oppressed groups by dictating and maintaining societal norms, traditions, and expectations. Now, historically, white heterosexual male group, me, generally fall into the oppressor group on critical theory, because we are the ones historically that have established societal norms, traditions, and expectations. I mean, it's no shock to know that most of history has involved white heterosexual men. I mean, that's just a historical fact, right? But yet, the assumption underlying critical theory is that the dominant group, in this case, white heterosexual males, set the norms by which all other groups are judged, and the dominant group maintains power by imposing its ideology on other groups, whatever groups they may be, female, non-white, non-traditional gender or sex orientation or sexual preference. And therefore, the power dynamic between those two groups is what is at issue here. The fundamental moral duty of critical theory is to liberate everyone, liberate people from oppression. Keep that in your mind. That is a key, because we're going to go back to that over and over again. So liberation of oppressed groups, and again, oppressed groups can change depending on which two group of people we're talking about. Liberation of oppression is the highest moral goal. Race, class, gender, all forms of discrimination must be abolished at all costs. So you're probably thinking to yourself, well, okay, I mean, that seems pretty reasonable. I mean, I would say we need to abolish, discrimination, and we need to abolish oppression. I mean, that seems like a pretty reasonable thing, right? It seems consistent with a Christian worldview. I mean, oppression is highly immoral. We shouldn't oppress people, right? So on the surface, it seems as if this is a pretty reasonable view. But we're going to get into the details of actually how this plays out. And that's where you've got to pay careful attention to how this is actually manifests itself. Three more key points. Subjective lived experiences, or what we call storytelling, are more important than objective evidence and reason in understanding oppression. This is unbelievably important. For the last 2 millennia, we have relied on logic, reason, and critical thinking, a very uniquely white male Western linear way of thinking, to solve problems. Critical theory would say that works except when it comes to oppression. Oppression, you cannot use that way of thinking. You must rely on storytelling, lived experiences, kind of like the video, feelings, emotions. The video obviously parodies some of this by saying feelings are more important than facts. But that is a very big part of critical theory. If you read this book, I have read this book, and I'm going to give you some quotes from this book, direct quotes that I scanned and put on a slide. You're going to see what I'm talking about. This is a collection, an anthology of stories, people's lived experiences when it comes to either race, class, or gender oppression. Now, again, we're not going to minimize people's personal experiences, but personal experiences, lived feelings, and emotions are elevated above facts and reason and evidence. I think you can kind of see where that could lead if things were to go the wrong way, right? And we'll talk about this. There's really some super good examples of this just in the last 2 months, in popular culture. So we'll talk about that. Privileged groups promote their own agenda under the guise of objectivity. How many of you have ever heard, oh, we can't trust anything in history. History's biased because it was written by the victors, the white male victors. And we had that in our uni class, right? That's critical theory. You can't trust history because, after all, it was written by the people that were the victors. And you only got one side of the story. That's critical theory. Although historical forms were thought to be neutral and objective, they were in fact biased toward their own agenda, toward their own means. So history really can't be trusted anymore. This is critical theory. This is how people see, and which is why we see a lot of things today in society where people are kind of denying history. Historical facts are being just put aside, and instead lived personal experiences are rising to the top in terms of how to actually make decisions and think. And then the last one was maybe not as important, but in the sense of what we're going to discuss tonight, but intersectionality. You probably heard that term, right? So people that have that satisfy the criteria for more than one group, more than one oppressed group, experience an intersectionality of their oppression. And so an example would be, say, an African American lesbian female. She would be clearly would be in a minority in a number of different groups, and there should be solidarity between different oppressed groups based on the historical oppression that each one has experienced. Okay, so these are sort of the run rules of critical theory. Now, what I want to do is, with this in mind, I want to take it forward a few steps and see where this worldview would lead if you actually try to apply it in everyday life. And I think what you're going to find is you're going to see things that look quite familiar with that are consistent with this way of thinking. So the practical outworkings, and there's only 3 here. I realize it's a lot of words. The practical outworking of critical theory really can be divided into 3 ideas. One, there are inherent asymmetries between people and the group with which they're associated. So for example, if a man is engaged in a discussion with a woman, independent of ethnicity or race, just male, female, I, as the male, am by definition the oppressor. The woman, by definition, is the oppressed. And therefore, the relationship we have is driven by this oppressor-oppressed dynamic. However, if that same woman, let's just say she's heterosexual, is engaged in a discussion with another woman who's a sexual minority, she now becomes the oppressor, and the other person becomes the oppressed. So this is extremely important to keep in mind. The boundaries are not, you can find yourself in multiple categories depending on what the relationship is to the person with whom you're speaking. Does that make sense? Does that kind of make sense? Okay? The emphasis on groups over individuals is extremely, extremely important. So you'll hear this word a lot, identity politics, right? So there is very much a thought that if you are, let's just, for example, a young heterosexual white female, you should support abortion on demand. That is a position of that group as a whole. Now, if you, as a heterosexual young white female, decided, no, I'm not going to support that view, I'm going to be pro-life, you now have engaged in something that is contrary to what the group as a whole thinks. And you will be ostracized. In fact, the rules of power engagement are conveniently dropped when a member of the oppressed group, now remember, you're female, you're in the oppressed group, but the moment you step out of that group and express your own view, and you don't represent a view of the group as a whole, you are an outcast. In fact, this is where it gets crazy. If I, as a white male, who is by definition always the oppressor, if I showed solidarity to a group of women who supported abortion on demand, let's say I, for example, supported abortion on demand, I'd be welcomed in over the woman who fits their group, that class, but doesn't share their view. Does that make sense? I know it's a little kind of strange to say. So one of the things about critical theory is it has structures of power dynamics, but those rules can get changed or dropped in an instant if the individual has a view that doesn't represent that of the group as a whole. And I would be willing to bet any of the young ladies in here that have gone to an abortion rights rally, and you had your sign that said I choose life, or all life is valuable, you probably got a pretty hostile response, I'm guessing, because you weren't representing the views of the group as a whole, even though you're female and you are supposed to be in the oppressed group when we're dealing with somebody like me. But if you don't represent the views as a whole, of the views of the group as a whole, you are out. You are now an oppressor. Your view is oppressive to them. They see your view as oppressive to them because it doesn't agree with what the societal norm should be for that group. Does that make sense? So it's not just, we have a different opinion. No. If you're a young white female and you don't support abortion on demand, you are actually, in their mind, acting oppressively toward the view of young white female women, most of whom do support abortion on demand. Yes?
I figured it out.
Okay, all right. So you can kind of see this gets tricky depending on the topic, the group of people with whom you are associating, and the dynamics between the groups. Okay, yes, go.
So what happens when whatever they're going for becomes the societal norm? Would they be considered oppressors towards let's say pro-life went.
If pro-life view became the societal norm?
No.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I misunderstood you.
Pro-choice became the norm.
It is the norm. It is the norm.
So wouldn't they be considered the oppressors?
Oh, we're getting there. We're getting there. We're getting there. You're about 3 slides ahead of me. You're about 3 slides ahead of me, yes.
Going back to the oppressors dictate societal norms.
Yes.
People are dictating the norms of their own group.
Yes, correct. Correct. You're gonna. I've got a slide. That goes through the logical evaluation of this view. Again, I'm just kind of setting the stage for you. But yes, I think you're already starting to see it. Yes, Aaron.
That is an honest question. If
Yep.
a heterosexual woman
Yep.
is engaged in a competition with a homosexual man, who is the oppressor and who's the
The man, because he's male.
Always.
Always. Men are always the oppressor. I'm just telling you right now. Men are always the oppressor. Doesn't matter color, race, nothing. Yes.
Where do we get this hierarchy of who's more oppressed than the other?
Right here. The books, the material that have been used to publish this idea, this thinking, going back, the philosophy of this worldview, going back to the 90s, actually going back to the 1930s, but it really manifested itself with this view. Yeah, I know. Oh yeah, no, it's fascinating. Yes, Robert.
So you say the person who's the oppressor and the oppressed is always dictated based on the situation. Is there ever a situation where there is no oppressor and oppressed and there's just peers?
Nope.
Or is it always...
Always oppressor and oppressed. Everybody falls into one of 2 groups. There is, in fact, that is the fundamental assumption of critical theory. There is no neutrality. That is the fundamental assumption. Everybody falls into this group or that group, depending on the relationship between the 2. Yes.
Do people who, I guess, have this way of thinking, do they also believe in social Darwinism? And do you believe
I would say most probably do. We're going to get to that in a minute because there is an element of this worldview which aligns with relativism and postmodernism. There's also an element of this worldview that relates very closely to modernism, scientific material naturalism. And there's also an element of this worldview that relates very closely to socialism and Marxism. This worldview is incredibly complex. It has many, many pieces to it. So yeah, the answer is yes, but there's more than just yes. It's not just that. Yes.
To piggyback off of Rob,
Yep.
your question. So to go back to our group, white, female, pro-choice.
Yep.
So even within that group,
Yep.
everyone's thinking the same thing, and you have 2 women. There will always, even in the same group, still be oppressor, oppressed. There's some trait that's difference between the 2.
Even if they have the same social view?
Sure.
It depends on it depends on the thing on which they differ.
Okay.
Right? It depends on the view in which they differ. You have to do it case by case. So I'm using simple examples here, but yeah, generally it depends on the topic in question. Yes.
So essentially, it goes based off of who is, I guess, most valuable within secular society.
Yeah, correct. In fact, that's one of the points that was up here. Yep. But who is most valuable? Who has been viewed most valuable in a traditional sense? Where am I here? Dominant group. Yeah, tradition. Right. So they have been thought to be the most valuable to society traditionally, historically, right? And so it follows with that. Okay. So that's the first one. I only got to the first one. Oh, the second one. Okay, third one. Here we go. Rules of engagement. Oh boy, this is the one you really got to know. Members of the dominant group, and I'll just use myself as an example because you can't get any more oppressive than me. You cannot. White, male, heterosexual, Christian. Yeah, I mean, I'm it. I check every box. I am the most oppressive person, yeah, you will ever meet. Oh, and of European descent. Italian, German, Euro. I check every box there is. Members of the dominant group are prohibited from questioning or challenging the lived experiences of the oppressed group, kind of like the video, right? So, for example, if a member of the oppressed group says, well, I've had this lived experience, and a member of the oppressor group, me, says, well, okay, I accept that, but can you give me some evidence, some proof of this? No, sir. You are not allowed to question their lived experiences. So, for example, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we had a man who was being considered for the Supreme Court nomination. A woman, a college professor, accused him of sexual misconduct. She gave her story of her lived experience of what happened to her. Now, we don't minimize people's lived experience. It's clearly something happened to that woman. But the minute anybody started to question, particularly men, started to question her lived experience, what were they called? What were those men labeled as? Sexist, rape, apologists, oppressive. The minute they just asked for evidence, nope, can't do it. Because lived experiences outweigh facts, evidence, and data. That's a problem. That's a problem. Because she was one of the oppressed groups. She's a woman, a white female, and he was a white male. Well, we know where that power dynamic resides. And so she, by definition, is in the oppressed group. So the oppressor group cannot question the experiences of the oppressed group. That's considered oppressive, to question your lived experience. Yes?
I mean, I guess on the foundation that whoever's in the oppressor group is impossible to understand the point of view
Exactly.
of the oppressed group.
You bet. You bet.
Can't.
Right, exactly. I mean, how could I ever know what it's like to be a female who was sexually assaulted? I can't. So there you go. You're not allowed to ask questions. You're not allowed to question it. Very much like men can't have an opinion on abortion. There's no possible way I could ever have an abortion. Therefore, I have no opinion. According to critical theory, I cannot have an opinion on that subject because it's a woman's issue. I'm not a woman, and I clearly have never had an abortion. So it's off limits. And for me to even question the lived experiences of that person is oppressive. It's viewed as being oppressive. And in fact, the oppressed group actually has the right in their mind to push back on that and take action, kind of like the video we saw with the guy in the box. They are justified in doing things to stop what they feel is oppression, and even if it means doing things that, like taking physical action or force. Yeah, somebody had a hand up. Yes, Chris.
Well, interesting scenario, but like, who would be believed in the sense that there was two women accusing each other of sexual misconduct?
That's a hard one. That one, that's a tough one. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you can certainly come up with different scenarios of possible ways. That's a harder one. That's a harder one. Don't know. I'm not really sure where that would go. That probably wouldn't get much publicity or much press, in all honesty. Yeah, right. Yeah, don't know.
What if you identified as a black female?
Okay, now we'll get into that later. This is, interestingly enough, this does not deal very much with identity, like, I identify as an African-American female, so therefore I'm oppressed. No, it doesn't work that way. See, this is where critical theory is tough, because somebody who is in the oppressed group is going to want to associate with that oppressed group. They're not going to no one is ever going to want to say, I identify as a heterosexual white Christian male. Because by definition, you're in the oppressor group. So they don't, again, the rules are conveniently dropped. So people don't switch groups just based on their feelings, right? You have an association with a group based on your race, your gender, your ethnicity, your sexual preference, and that's it. And it fits into those categories. Now, maybe that'll change as time goes on, but I don't see anything in the literature that says, if I identify this way, now I'm part of the oppressed group. I don't see anything with that, at least at this point. Yeah. Somebody had a hand up? Maybe? No? Okay. All right, so hang with me. We're going to get to actually some good stuff. So before Hurricane Florence threw everybody's life into a tizzy, does anybody remember what happened in Chapel Hill? Yeah. So now here's where, let me go back real quick. Before I do that, I did want to go over one thing. So thoughts, actions, and statements which would be condemned from a member of the dominant group are explicitly prohibited, are explicitly acceptable and even encouraged from the oppressed group. Think about that for a minute. Thoughts, actions, and statements which would be condemned from a member of the dominant group, me, are actually acceptable from members of the oppressed group. So for example, if I went and knocked over a statue of something, no big deal. In fact, I'd probably get thrown in jail. But if a group does this, it's completely acceptable. Why? Because in their mind, they are fighting oppression. They justify this by saying this statue is oppressive, represents slavery, sex, racism, it must come down. And in their mind, they have justified destroying public property because they see this as oppressive. And they take action on it. Now, if I went and took down a statue of George Washington or whatever because I thought he was oppressive, nothing would happen other than me get thrown in jail for destroying public property. But this kind of behavior is acceptable because they see this, they see these things as oppressive. And their job, the ultimate goal of critical theory, is to eliminate oppression wherever it is. This is oppressive, it must come down. And in fact, if they break the law doing it, it doesn't matter. If they injure somebody, it doesn't matter. If they destroy public property, it doesn't matter. If they set buildings on fire, it doesn't matter. Ridding the world of oppression is the highest moral goal, and any means necessary can be used to justify it because it's oppressive, and they see it as oppressive, and they take action to remove oppression, to remove what they think is oppressive. Yes, you had your hand up?
Yeah, just because I'm super uninformed.
Yeah, right.
What's the statue of?
This is Silent Sam, which was a Civil War statue. And of course, the Duke had it, like, I don't know, a year ago, Duke took down a statue. They're going down all over the place. Yeah. Confederate. Yeah, Confederate. Yep. Yep. Now, if I showed up and said, hey, you shouldn't take that down. I mean, look, I don't agree with racism and slavery, but this is part of history. We should preserve this. As a white heterosexual male, how do you think that would be received? Yeah, I would be perceived, I would be perceived as racist and oppressive because I'm not agreeing that this needs to come down. Now, I don't agree with what this stood for, but I also don't agree we should go around defacing public property just because we don't like something, right? And so this is the problem we get into with this sort of attitude, this sort of thinking. If anything is viewed as being oppressive, it must end. Now, come over here. Last week, a student at UNCW and a member of Ratio Christi go and try to get funding for the women from the Women's Resource Center for a debate between, oh my goodness, two men on the topic of abortion. Nope. Abortion's a women's issue. We're not going to sponsor that. Now, why would they think that way? Because men talking about abortion is oppressive to women. Men shouldn't talk about abortion. It's oppressive. And the person who ruled or decided that they're not going to support this because it's two men literally think that men are being oppressive if they try to talk about abortion, as if ideas and arguments somehow have a gender associated with them. Right? And so they truly think they are justified. Now, what problems do you see with this? Where do you see this going? Gender discrimination and First Amendment problems. I can't express my guaranteed First Amendment right of free speech because I'm a man and the topic's abortion? They don't see it that way. What's that?
Men wrote the First Amendment.
Yeah, exactly. So here we go. They think that is oppressive, even if it means preventing someone else from exercising their own First Amendment right. That's the thinking. Yes, Grant, had your hand up.
I might just be splitting hairs.
Yep.
So what if the two male participants
Yep.
wrote out their debate, gave it to two female participants, and they read the debate?
That would probably be okay.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
There's an issue there. I mean,
Right.
it's still a man.
Sure. Now, in this case, the two men, one white, one African American, doesn't matter. They're men. Doesn't matter what the color of their skin is. They're men. Men cannot talk about a women's issue. It's oppressive. We're not going to allow it. Yes.
So usually at like Rashi meetings, whenever like we see a worldview that kind of like contradicts the gospel, like for example the idea of like all truth is subjective.
Yep.
Kind of learn the response of all truth is subjective. That truth that you just told.
Sure. That must be subjective too. Yep.
So like if someone was to say like you can't have an abortion opinion because you're a male, what would be like a good response to that? Or are we getting to that later?
So, let's just talk about that. How was the decision to allow women to have uncontrolled access to abortion arrived at? Right. 9 old white guys on the Supreme Court in 1973 decided that women should have unrestricted access to abortion. So according to that logic, that decision needs to be overturned immediately because men are not supposed to have an opinion on abortion. But boy, there was 9 men having an opinion on abortion, wasn't it? That's the logical incoherence of critical theory. And we're going to get to that in a minute. But there are all kinds of logical inconsistencies. Yes?
And on top of that, like, it draws, I guess, the idea that someone can't make a decision if they're not.
Exactly. Like, sure, exactly. Exactly. So according to this, nobody in this room can have an opinion on war unless you've served in the military. What? I mean, that would eliminate, like, I don't know, half the last 2 presidents at least, and maybe more. Yes.
Devil's advocate, but wouldn't it still be consistent for for someone to say 2 men can't talk about it?
Right.
But 9 white guys in Roe v. Wade, that they're allowed because they agree with the oppressed group.
Well, at the time they didn't agree with the view. Remember, at the time abortion was not legal, so they were actually going the opposite way of the traditional view. Right? Because at the time, the traditional view up to that point was abortions are not legal.
So they made their own group.
Sure.
Wasn't that at the time, though, where we had the Now movement, and they wanted the equal amendment?
Yep, equal rights. Yep. Yeah, part of this, too, there's an element of this that deals with second-wave feminism that goes back into the 70s. I won't go into it. But there are a lot of factors that affect this. Yes?
Also, I have another question.
Yes. Yeah, you bet.
But what is it? Speaking about, I guess, the public defamation or vandalism.
Yep.
Do you think vandalism in groups is just overlooked in general? You know what I mean? Because, I mean, I know you mentioned if you yourself went out and destroyed silence,
yep,
it would be an issue. But, like,
right.
If you and a bunch of buddies got
Yep, me and a bunch of old white men got together, yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
This isn't right, destroy that at night.
Yep.
You know what I mean, like, what would happen?
Yeah.
One person.
Yeah, no, I don't know for sure if the individual versus the group. In other words, it definitely deals with group dynamics. So certainly group is certainly a big part of this. The problem you get in is when one person who's supposed to be in this group behaves differently than the rest of the group. That's where things get difficult. Like the female who doesn't support abortion. That's where things get a little tougher, right?
But
so, yeah.
In that case,
yep.
We actually have evidence that the campus police knew that it was going to happen and actually were ordered to stand down by the administration to let that happen.
Yeah. So
it wasn't like they were like, well, we did.
Right. Now, why do you think they were given those instructions? Let's take this. Let's go with this. Why were they given why were the police given that instruction?
Because they didn't want to be labeled as.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Together was to drag somebody they disagree with out of their home and stone them, and the officials tell the police to let it happen.
We are going to talk about reductio ad absurdum in a minute. But yes, that is exactly the problem. Right? Is it starting to make sense now? Are you starting to see it? This is exactly the reason why. No university official ever wants to be labeled as being oppressive. And if you try to stop this, especially if you're an older white heterosexual male, I guarantee you're going to be labeled as an oppressor because that's how that's viewed. I know it's crazy to think this, but this is how it works. So that's why police are given the instructions, let them tear it down. Think about that. Allow destruction of public property. Ooh, yeah, you're right. Where's that going to lead? Yes, Sarah.
So I'm originally from Capitol Hill, so my parents live like right there.
Uh-huh.
And they were telling me that they were scared that like people after they did that were gonna go and like do other things like vandalize.
Sure.
Like our house.
You bet.
Like, we literally live like right there.
Oh yeah.
So it's just like another.
Yep. It is. So we're going to talk about taking this thinking to its logical conclusion in a minute. But yeah, I think you're already starting to see where this could go. Okay, I know we got a lot to cover. So here is, I copied and I've extracted some information from this book. So I want you to read this. I want to go through this with you so you see this. I pulled out 4 or 5 paragraphs from the primary authors, Anderson and Collins. This is the first paper in the book, but every paper in here reads the same way. So look at some of the words that you see here. And I took the first one right out. This is the beginning paragraph of the book. In this book, we ask students to think about race, class, and gender as systems of power. We want to encourage people to imagine ways to transform rather than reproduce existing social arrangements. They fundamentally want to change existing social arrangements. They think the historic social arrangements are very, very bad. Sexist, racist, homophobic, you name it. And so we need to change existing social arrangements. Many of the works, in fact, much exciting work on the intersection of race, class, gender appear in autobiographies, self-biographies, fiction, which I think is hysterical. I mean, they're literally saying this isn't real, and personal essays. It's all about lived experiences. It's all about personal feelings, and in some cases, fiction. That's the basis that forms this worldview, this thinking. Here's where it gets a little scary. Yeah, go ahead, Gino.
I mean, we also point out that it's in fact, much exciting work on intersection. Exciting doesn't. It's almost like because it's exciting, therefore it's important.
Yeah, well, I mean, and you see this all throughout the book. You see.
Chemistry isn't necessarily no offense.
Hey, chemistry's exciting. Chemistry's exciting. Not as exciting as physics. Okay, but all right, I'm with you. I'll go with you on that one. But here, take a look at this. For example, the capitalist class relations that have characterized all U.S. phases of history routinely privilege or penalize groups based on race and gender. Capitalism is sexist. Capitalism is racist.
That's Dr. Tom's fault.
There you go. This is why so many of your fellow students embrace socialism. Because capitalism is fundamentally biased, racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, all the phobics, because it has been biased by people like me throughout history, and it can't be trusted. Seriously, this is why most of your fellow students are socialists, because they think the system of capitalism is fundamentally flawed. That's why young politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are proud to identify themselves as democratic socialists. Why do you think Bernie Sanders almost beat Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination? Oh my goodness. Yes, it's this. Yes?
Wouldn't that be a composition fallacy to say that everybody who participates in capitalism is racist?
Yeah.
And capitalism itself is racist?
Yeah, we'll get to it.
Okay.
We'll get to it. There's fallacies are all over the place in this. Fallacies are all over the place. This is probably my favorite one of all. In the opening readings of this section, we begin by providing personal accounts, I probably should have circled personal accounts, of what exclusion means and how it feels. We rely on personal accounts that reflect on experiences to build up empathy among groups and emotional stance. I mean, they are clearly appealing to feelings and emotion and lived experiences. And then the bottom one, I think, is just fantastic. Changing one's mind is not just a matter of assessing facts and data. It requires examining one's feelings and personal narratives. I'm going to tell you, if you rely on your feelings to figure out what is true in life, you're going to have a bumpy ride. I'm just telling you right now. Now, look, I don't mean to say that feelings are of no value at all. I mean, look, God made us as emotional creatures. We have feelings. We do. But you've got to be very careful when elevating that above fact and evidence and reason. And that's really where this begins to get in, I think, into a trouble spot. Okay, so now I'm really going to scare you. You think this has been fun? So this slide was given to me. I'm probably going to get fired by doing this. This slide was given to me by your university. Yeah, we're gonna have to delete this from the video. This slide was given to me by your university to help me teach you better. This was given to them. Said, here, please use this so you can be a better instructor for our freshman students. So here's what they said. They use an example, and then there's two slides here. There's this one and the next one. And they use this as an example of a way to reframe assumptions and thinking. So they say, hey, the traditional thinking has been that clinical depression is caused by external circumstances. This is the way we traditionally have thought about depression. The way to deal with it is reason your way through it, snap out of it. Medications are for those too weak to deal with the world. And this way of thinking has been rooted in white male patriarchy. That's the root. And of course, we all know that can't be trusted, right? Because, and traditionally, men have been entrusted to make decisions based on superior logic and rationality. But what happens if we reframe the assumptions? Depression is not a flaw in your character. It's a chemical imbalance in your brain. Notice, not mind, brain. Very modern worldview thinking. And go ahead.
The previous slide
Yeah.
referred to medications, and that's what treats it.
Correct. But what they're saying is we shouldn't do that. We should use talk, and cognitive behavior is helpful against medication. My responsibility is to make appropriate public disclosure of my own response to my own depression. This guy's giving a personal example. He's using it as a personal example. And so what he's saying is, look, depression's not a flaw in your character. It's a chemical imbalance in your brain. And therefore, there's other ways to deal with it other than the traditional white male patriarchy. Yes, Heather?
Are the writer of this slide saying that medication is not a practical option for depression?
What they're saying is, what they're saying is the traditional view throughout history has been, let me go back, the white male patriarchal view, why is it not going back? Hold on. Has been, here we go. Yep. They're saying that the traditional way is to reason your way through it. Medications are for the people that are weak. And of course, you just need to work your way through this. Just snap out of it, right? You bet. Come on, just snap out of it. It's, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Right. That is the traditional view, right? But of course, that's rooted in the ideology of patriarchy and can't be trusted. And so they're reframing the assumptions and saying, look, it's a chemical imbalance in your brain. It's not a flaw in your character. There's nothing wrong with you. It's not a flaw in your character. It's a chemical imbalance. And you can talk, and cognitive behavior is better, yes.
It says not flaw in your character. Is it to mean, because I just like to define the term, is it A, this does not need to be fixed because there's not a flaw in you?
Right.
Or B, this is not something that's bad that needs to be dealt with?
I think it's the first one, but I don't know for sure. I think it's the first one. But what I would say, yeah, go ahead, Heather.
Typically, when people say depression isn't a flaw in character, they just mean like you're not a bad person because you're depressed.
Correct. Right. It's not immoral or anything wrong with you as a person. Yes.
What standard are they using to say what is moral and what is not moral?
Oh, that is totally up for grabs. Completely up for grabs. Right. Completely up for grabs. But one thing you notice about this is they seem to be treating people as biochemical machines. It's not the mind, it's just the brain. And of course, you're just responding to your chemical imbalance in your brain, and you just shouldn't take more medication. That's not going to help you. Maybe talk and cognitive therapy is better. So it has a modernistic view, right? It has the feel of a modernistic view. So far we've seen it has a postmodern sort of element to it, critical theory, which is relativism, but it also has this modern view of scientific naturalism, that we're really just molecules in motion, as Frank Turek would say.
So I'm confused about the logical outworking of this, because if it is true that like a leg is broken, a doctor would say don't walk on it.
Correct.
It can't do that.
Right.
If we're talking about depression, particularly someone who actually has a chemical imbalance, why wouldn't they say medication wouldn't do
They
that?
probably could recommend it. I think what they're saying is in the general case, medication is overprescribed for everything, right? But yeah, there may be instances where it could be prescribed, right? But I think what they're saying is maybe it's been abused because of white male patriarchy in the past. Yeah. You're right. I mean, this is a personal example this professor put together just to help illustrate the point. Yeah.
Is it like a reference to back in like kind of way before Victorian times?
Right.
Women would be into what they would be. They said that you have hysteria or you have it because they'd be put into state hospitals.
Right. Right.
Maybe a response to that,
Possibly, but again, that would be white male patriarchy, right? Determining, okay, what's wrong with this person?
Like the fear of like overusing like medical.
Yeah. Yeah, probably so. Yep.
This may be a little different, but today I noticed on Facebook we have some posts about voting. The question
Can who?
Felons.
Felons. Not a convicted felon, no.
Not a convicted felon.
Nope, as far as I know. Right, Aaron? I'm not a lawyer. We need lawyers. Who's the lawyer in the crowd?
Where are you going with this, Chris?
Yeah, where are we going with this, Chris?
So that is the convicted felon is somebody who's made a terrible, bad moral decision, and we're saying that's based on their character. But here we're seeing that, it's a chemical imbalance.
Right. Oh, you're 4 slides ahead of me now. We're going to get there. We're going to get there. We're going to get to that. So these are the kind of things that are sort of taught and sort of put together to help shape a worldview. This is another example. This is a professor who has put this together to help us to be better teachers to you. Historical assumption, historical thinking. I'm a good white person. I'm free of racism. I have self-knowledge. I can monitor my racism. I'm free of microaggressions. Racism is something committed by less enlightened whites and friends and colleagues. So I'm a good white person. Reality, I regularly commit racial microaggressions. How I run my meetings, how I do my classes, my jokes. And when it's pointed out, we immediately deny any overt racism. Because after all, we are associated with a group, white male patriarchy. And so we don't see this, right? That's part of the definition of critical theory is the oppressors don't see themselves as oppressor. That's why it's oppressive, because they don't see the problem. They don't see themselves as oppressive. So these are the kind of things, this is the worldview from which instructors are taught to teach you. So they take this into the classroom and use this as a way of teaching you. Now, let's look just quickly at some of the similarities between critical theory and Christianity. Then we're going to look at the differences so you can kind of compare and contrast. Okay, I would agree, critical theory recognizes that oppression in all its forms is grossly immoral and should be eliminated. Christians, I think, and you can disagree with me if you want, should affirm that ruling class groups, whoever they may be, who abuse their power, abuse is the key word, abuse their power, oppressing weaker and marginalized groups is morally wrong. What we would say as Christians is power is not oppressive. The abuse of power is oppressive. Critical theory would say power is oppressive. And anytime there's a power imbalance, you have an oppressor and an oppressed. What Christians would say is, no, it's the abuse of power that's oppressive. And there's actually a number of scriptures, I only pointed out Proverbs here, that people who are in positions of authority, kings, presidents, leaders, whoever, who have a hierarchy of power in society should never abuse their power. That is oppressive. But power itself is not oppressive. In fact, we need structure and hierarchy in order to have a functioning society. But critical theory would say, no, all power is oppressive. So we would agree that you should eliminate oppression, but only when it deals with the abuse of power, not power itself. We would agree as Christians that the reason for abuse of power is ultimately human sin, right? We would agree that the depravity of the human heart, where's Tom Jaski out there, is the root of all much suffering and evil. The reason there is abuse of power is because we are sinful, fallen creatures. And that's what leads to corruption, and that's what leads to oppression. So we would agree that power imbalance exists with the abuse of power. Critical theorists give special attention to the marginalized and forgotten people of society. We are commanded to do that in Scripture. We are commanded to affirm the value and dignity of all human life. We should be the first to come to the rescue of marginalized and forgotten people in society, widows, orphans. And all people are created in Imago Dei, right, in the image of God. So everybody has equal value. So everybody should be valued in the same way. Yes?
One thing that I had a question that you
Yes.
just answered
Yeah.
through the whole time is there's this fundamental worldview that people are good, that like a Christian worldview would disagree, like we're,
Yes.
think we're bad,
Right.
there's something wrong with us. So I wondered this whole time, well, if you're an oppressor, that make you bad. How do they recognize that someone could be good? And it's because power becomes the bad thing.
Correct.
They put it into something.
Power itself is the problem.
Not you.
Not
You're fundamentally
correct.
good. You just need to understand your goodness.
Boop. And that's the problem. So it's not the abuse of power, it's power itself that is the problem. There you go for Lexi. Okay, so that's good. You see that. Okay, now let's look at some differences between Christianity and critical theory. Christianity would say all people should be held with equal dignity and value. We're all created in God's image. Critical theory would say, no, not really. People's value is based on what class or group or race or gender with which they're associated. So they're not equally balanced. Some people have more rights than others. If you're in an oppressed group, you have more freedom to do things that the oppressor group would never be allowed to do because you're in the oppressed group and you're fighting oppression. So it's not equal, right? Whereas Christianity would say